Hello, everyone. We are about 2 minutes out before our next Impact Tuesdays webinar featuring Futures Without Violence. So I am going to give you time to log in, get settled, get some coffee, whatever you need to get comfortable, and we will be beginning promptly at 1 o'clock. Thanks.
Programs even at the federal level around how they can create programs, how they can work on strategy, how they can just have conversations on a day-to-day basis and facilitate these types of discussions. That's generally speaking what I do, and happy to share more based on whatever you think is helpful.
Thank you. Brian.
Hi, my name is Brian O'Connor, and I have been with Futures Without Violence for 15 years and helped create Coaching Boys into Men. Originally, or before Futures, I was in advertising in New York City, and I was also a journalist. And so we'll talk more about it, obviously, but Coaching Boys into Men, starting off as a broad public awareness campaign on issues of prevention and the elimination of violence against women, was one where coaching was a metaphor to engage men from all walks of life. And so it was more in my wheelhouse around kind of from a campaign standpoint, and then it's focused in on the program that it is today. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the invitation.
No, of course. And I do want to point out, Futures Without Violence is a national organization, right? So Brian and Jesse, you are both with us today from the West Coast, from California. I guess you're not in the office, but you're in California. And there are other offices that the organization has, right, in other parts of the country.
Mm-hmm. Correct. We have an office in Boston, which focuses in on our child welfare work primarily, as also some work that we do on college campuses. And in DC, no surprise, is really focused in on policy work.
Sure. So can we talk a little bit about the broad mission of Futures and then kind of get into the specifics about Coaching Boys into Men, which is the program that JWF has been funding for the past couple of years. So what does the organization do? What is the overall mission?
So broadly, we work to end violence against women and children. And we do that in a number of areas, or I'd say approaches, particularly around, one, leadership development. And so how are we raising the capacity of local organizations and partner associations that are doing direct service work? So Futures is not a direct service organization, and yet we work with hundreds of other organizations that are working on shelter programs, providing direct service delivery. And so one of our core pillars of the work that we do in our approach around leadership development is how are we working with and training and building the capacity of local advocates? How are we working with educators in schools? How are we also engaging with healthcare providers and emergency room staff when women primarily are coming in with injuries, and how do you assess and address those issues with compassion? How do we have trained roughly 70% of judges in this country, particularly juvenile and family court judges, around issues of domestic violence, where an example is someone comes in and it's the third time that this survivor has been in your courtroom with the safety plan having gone awry, and she keeps kind of going back to him. And really being able to really unpack and work with judges on the complexities of domestic violence, on why people stay in what are dangerous situations, the isolation and issues of economic and labor isolation that can also take place in certain relationships. And so really spotlighting these key issues for leaders in the field that work in our community across a whole host of different systems and areas. I mentioned policy work Violence Against Women Act. We do national policy as well as state-specific policy, which is about trying to raise the resources and create an infrastructure that has safety nets around law enforcement, safety nets around protection, orders, et cetera, child welfare work that I was mentioning, particularly out of our Boston office, policy that's really able to provide resources and, like I said, a solid base and foundation to ensure that people remain safe and healthy. And then also then specifically now coaching women and men, and what I was talking about with my team around the public engagement, public education team. We work in public schools or in schools overall, but really public education around campaign and awareness building work that raises or seeks to change and transform the social and cultural norms around issues of violence against women. And so when we talk about issues of toxic masculinity, for example, and really starting upstream around how are we building healthy relationship skills amongst particularly the next generation and young people, is a cultural and social issue that we also really look at what are the environmental factors that enable violence to exist, and how can we then really help to address those and change them.
Just before I move on to Jesse to ask him a question, there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, or maybe the right corner of the screen, depending on if you're on a tablet. If there are questions from anyone, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature to submit them, and we will do our best to address them during our conversation, but also we will leave time at the end to answer any questions. So Jesse, I'm curious to know kind of how you arrived at Futures and what made you want to work in this kind of space.
No, I mean, thank you for asking. It's been a journey. I mean, it's been interesting. Brian and I have known each other for just about a year now, even though I started working at Futures full-time right around the time the shelter in place actually started, which is kind of very fortuitous timing to kind of have that, secured. But so I grew up in the Boston area. I moved out to the West Coast at the beginning of this year. And back in Boston, my background was really in youth leadership development and community organizing in Boston. So what that looked like was organizing actually around primarily issues that were not gender specific. So a lot of housing issues, a lot of education issues, inequities in education, and violence more broadly, including gun violence in Boston. And that was working with young people on their leadership skills. It was working with them on, their speaking skills, to testify in hearings, to be able to organize their peers. But coming from that background, it's partially why I care about this, is that, a lot of our programs, especially when we're thinking about ending violence, prevention, like Brian was saying, thinking very upstream, I think to young people, and the ways in which we can shift culture starting at a young age, that we can impact our education systems, our teachers, our coaches, whoever it might be. I know for me specifically, growing up as a bi teen, I experienced a lot of harassment and abuse that I think set the stage to understand the importance of education around healthy and abusive relationship patterns. Mm-hmm. And as someone who, when I was young, didn't feel like I had the ability to advocate for myself or knew what that looked like, that piece of empowerment and how do we equip people with advocacy skills to be able to intervene both on behalf of themselves and on behalf of other people, that's the type of cultural shift that I believe is really, really important and what has brought me to Futures. So just to round that off at the very end, when moving out to the West Coast, I knew that I needed gender-based work. I facilitated a few men's groups in the Boston area around accountability, around healing work, and moving out to the West Coast, I knew that this is the space that I wanted to be in. It was a very kind of random connection that originally got me in touch with Brian, and started working out here pretty much as soon as I got here at a part-time basis, and I've just been so excited to be full-time with them.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we're very excited about the work that you're doing. So I really appreciate, again, both of you being with us today on the webinar. So we have a little bit talked about gender-based violence, but I'm wondering if we can get maybe more specific. Looking at, let's say, the United States, because that's where we live. You know, like, what are some maybe important facts that you think everyone that is watching this should know about, and sort of like, why is this issue so important? And then we'll get into coaching boys into men and the piece around engaging men specifically in gender-based violence.
So
you can
I'll start, Jesse.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, you know, nearly 1/3 of women will report issues of violence and abuse in their lifetime that were at the hands of a spouse or partner, boyfriend, etc. And that's a huge number. I mean, you know, the specific averages and estimates range anywhere from, say, 26, 27% to 32% of women, depending on the study. And that's been consistent. However, when I was talking about the issue of social norms, it used to be a lot more, right? And what we also know is that, and when I talk about statistics, I also call out that, like, unfortunately, there really will never be the most accurate representation of the scourge that is domestic violence in our country and around the world, frankly, because so many people, so many incidents go unreported.
Sure.
The stigma of violence, particularly relationship abuse, is strong. And although we've made amazing strides, I mean, roughly 60% of incidents of domestic violence have decreased in the past 25 years in this country. I mean, when I first came onto Futures, really focused in on engaging men in 2005, you know, in doing some of the research, as late as the mid-'80s, spousal abuse was not a crime in several states in this country. Spousal rape was not a crime in several states in this country. So
right.
Getting laws changed and on the books is really important. What I'll highlight, though, I think, which is particularly relevant for this conversation, is that we know that 1 in 3 teens report knowing a friend or peer that is experiencing dating violence. And that, too, is one where, in thinking about prevention, it's also really, we focus heavily in on how do we become positive bystanders? How do we help young people particularly identify and increase their knowledge of abusive behaviors? So, for example, whether it's online, as we all might see some actions that are particularly alarming, whether it be stalking or harassment online, what we see is that we also want to then enable people to not only just identify what constitutes abuse, but also giving young people particularly ways in which to do something about it. When you see or hear something that's not okay in the hallway or the locker room or now, you know, on Zoom or, you know, online particularly. So, you know, one area that has moved us into really focusing in on young people is that up till about 2004, 2005, the statistic I gave, Jennifer, of, you know, roughly nearly 1 in 3 women report abuse in their lifetime, is for age 24 and over. Mm-hmm. We weren't even tracking young people and their exposure and experience with abuse. And so that is, frankly, still an area, a blind spot in this work, and an area that we've really been pushing and advocating for building up our research and evidence in understanding the scope and prevalence of the issue, particularly for our young people.
Mm. Jesse, do you want to add anything?
I think that was pretty comprehensive. Yeah.
Good job, Brian.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about engaging men specifically in this kind of work. And also, I do want to ask, I guess with coaching boys into men, but also even with other programs, we're talking about, because it's relationship or intimate partner violence. Does this also include, or does your work also include a lens for same-sex couples or non-binary couples, or basically anyone that falls outside of heterosexual couples.
Yeah, I'm happy to hop in. And I think the short answer is yes. So I think that there's two elements of this. One is that even in our Coaching Boys into Men curriculum, we have a lot of the content is really focused on, like Brian was saying, kind of bystander interventionists, but it's talking about broader themes around consent, broader themes around respect in relationships, digital abuse. All of those things apply to, regardless of the gender of a couple. And of course, Coaching Boys into Men is specifically engaging male athletes. We also have a female program counterpart called Athletes as Leaders. But I think that the other piece of this, in addition to the way in which the curriculum is not only gender specific, is that we know that so much of the roots of violence in this country, honestly, come from culture that's embedded. It's embedded in everyone, and don't get me, that is the case. And also, it's embedded within male culture. It's embedded within toxic masculinity. It's embedded within cultures of dominance and aggression that we see. And so us being able to tap into those things as some of the roots of violence, I think are really important. And in particular, in looking at the roots of Coaching Boys into Men, as being able to identify the ways in which men historically haven't known or haven't believed that they could get involved in violence prevention work. So providing an opportunity for men to be mentors and learning themselves as they are teaching and training young men, we just think is really critical. Do you have anything to add to that, Brian?
I have a few elements around the work we do specific in Coaching Boys into Men that's about like how we address homophobia and transphobia, which isn't exactly what you're getting at, Jennifer. It'll come up, I think, organically as we continue talking more about the program. I will say that short answer is yes, as Jesse said, and I think we could be doing more.
Okay. I mean, and so Jesse, you sort of touched upon my question that was coming next, which was, why do we want to engage men specifically when it comes to preventing violence? So Brian, if you have anything you want to add to what Jesse already said, we would love to hear that.
It's Jesse really touched on it, where when I said, I've been around a minute, right? So when I first came on and I talked about in my little intro that Coaching Boys into Men was not the program which the foundation is investing in and partnering with us on engaging athletic coaches, particularly in middle school and high schools, on talking with, and male athletic coaches by and large, talking with their athletes about issues of healthy relationships. And as Jesse said, consent, bragging about sexual reputation, personal responsibility. So each week, Coaching Boys into Men is a program that athletic coaches, well, and we'll talk more about COVID, I'm sure, right? Now that we're not meeting in person and the virtual reimagining that we're doing right now.
Right.
But those coaches talk with their athletes for 15 minutes a week around different topics throughout the course of this season. When it originally started, and I said coaching was a metaphor for engaging men from all walks of life, was because in the 90s, the awareness work that we were doing with the Violence Against Women Act being passed, and we knew that we were moving the needle with adult women, particularly around issues of domestic violence and sexual assault being one of their top two most important issues, from across a whole host of issues around hunger, environmental issues, broad national polling on a real host of really important social justice advocacy issues. But we knew we were only talking to 50% of the population, because when we polled men in 1999 to 2001, what we identified was it wasn't that men were also not identifying, and I'm talking about men, broad, monolithic group, and of course we can talk about, but men were identifying that issues of violence against women touched their life. They knew somebody, either their neighbor or a loved one or someone who they might work with. They knew what the issue was about, but they didn't know how to get involved. And they said because no one had asked them to. Mm. And so historically, it was like, well, we're not going to be able to solve this problem if we're only talking to 50% of the population. How do we enter into this conversation where men, not only as not perpetrators and not as an inactive bystander, but as someone who can be a real active part of the solution as a member of the community? And that was like the beginning of then moving towards, leveraging sports and all that other work. But we do work around fatherhood and young men on campus in fraternities. So the Engaging Men work and portfolio that not only Futures does, but with a whole host of partners, addresses and comes at trying to reach people where they are in a whole host of different environments and scenarios.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that too, yesterday, Brian and I were on a call with a number of educators, counselors, folks who work at community organizations, for this kind of educator hour that one of our partners had put on. And the focus was on engaging boys and men. And just one of the biggest takeaways that I had from it, along with some of the particularly college campus work that we've done at the federal level, is just that there is so much appetite for content and training and curricula around engaging men, because there's not a lot out there. I think that it's becoming a bigger part of our language now. I think in the mm-hmm. past few years, we've seen a lot of cultural shift. But people were, like, how do I have this conversation? How do I have this conversation with my son? How do I have this conversation with my brother? How do I have it with my teacher, with my students? And then at the more structural level, how do I create programs? Oh, I'm realizing that we don't have prevention programs in my school. We don't have leadership programs for boys around these types of topics of personal responsibility, about collective responsibility and respect and gender-based violence. And so I think that there is still such a huge gap in this field. And like Brian was saying, if we're only engaging 50% of the population, sure. Numbers wise, not even about kind of the cultural and power elements of this, sure. That's not a long-term solution. So I think that that's where something like Coaching Boys into Men, which is so specific, it's so easy, relatively speaking, to implement compared to kind of vague outlines of how you have conversations. That's where we try to step in, is to say, how do we lower the barrier, lower the bar for people to be able to enter into this work?
Yes. So we're, very proud to be supporting this program. Because I really do think that this is a social change program, and just changing, boys and men's attitudes around how they treat women, and even just having that kind of mindfulness, I think is really important. And before we officially started the webinar, Jesse and I were talking for a few minutes about how often we see that the narrative around domestic violence is sort of directed at women, where it's sort of our job to identify abusive traits in a partner, or it's our job to leave, right, if someone starts abusing us, and how just, sort of ridiculous that is on so many levels, to place the burden always on the person who's being victimized by their partner. So we're, just so happy that this program exists and that we're able to partner with you. I wanted to talk more about the actual program and how it works. How do people get involved with the program? How do the coaches find you? What kind of training do they go through? And then maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the the specific lessons that the coaches are implementing in their weekly coaching sessions.
So I kind of touched on it a little bit around the dynamics of each week and the athletic coaches. But Jesse, yeah. I don't know, do you want to share a little bit about, how coaches find us, right? Particularly about our local partnerships, I think is maybe a great way to.
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in.
There's two really core elements, I think. One is the local partnership that Brian mentioned. And I mean, I haven't even been at Futures for a whole year yet. Brian has been here for 15 years. So many of the partnerships that we have been cultivated by Brian. So I think you can speak to the historical element of this, which I think is so important, that this program has deep roots in a lot of organizations, a lot of colleges. We have a large research team backing us out of the University of Pittsburgh at this point. But we have, the way that we work is a train the trainer method. So we train advocates at a local level. So primarily these are folks who work at domestic violence centers, prevention organizations, and we train them in how to, I guess, administer the program by training athletic coaches in the curriculum. And that takes place in a 2-hour training that we find to be more than sufficient to really set up coaches for success. And then they provide ongoing support over the course of the program when there might be, for instance, consent, we know, is a really challenging topic for a lot of athletic coaches. So being able to talk to a coach about, oh, well, how did that go? What were the challenges? What are you expecting to say during the lessons? But in terms of that connecting and outreach piece, it's really hard work at the local level for advocates to be able to bring in coaches. You know, it's a lot of recruiting athletic directors, a lot of finding those individual coaches who care about these issues because they're out there, and finding those key allies, I think, has been one of the most significant reasons why the program has seen success. So there's that local outreach aspect. And then the other way is really through our website and the different programs that we have. We have the Coaches Corner website, which has a huge amount of information for folks to be to get trained in the program, to have promotional materials for the program. And you know, we really have prioritized over the years the accessibility of the materials. We don't want there to be a huge fee to access the, you know, we want this to be something you can download and use right away. We have a number of webinars on the website as well for advocates to get trained so that they know how the evaluation works, so that they know how the community outreach works, and so they know how to train coaches. In addition to that, one thing that we're really looking forward to that we've done more in the past few years is these kind of bigger scale trainings for advocates at the statewide level. We also held an institute in San Francisco last summer in 2019 to train advocates from across the United States, as well as a few international advocates in the program. And so that's something we, of course, had many more. We had a few of those statewide trainings on the books for this year before a lot of COVID stuff hits. Florida, New Jersey, and some other places. And I mean, that I think is the goal. How do we train folks across a whole state to really be implementing and doing outreach in the program? So Brian, maybe you can jump in with some of the details of like the texture, the week to week, and what the coaches are doing.
Sure, I'll follow up on the institute particularly you talked about last year. Well, and the model where, you know, we have a pretty, you know, we like to say that we're a pretty lean team, right? Small but mighty, right, is what we say. And so, because it really is about local, it is really about partnership. We say that our middle name is partnership. And so JWF, our first award, really focused in on how we were starting off with statewide training in Florida, particularly too working with Central Florida and some of the partners there and building capacity of advocates who might already have relationships, say, with a school, but also, you know, and just a caveat is that we always, whenever I'm talking about the program, I default to talking particularly even about high school, but high school and middle school. And there's a whole host of adaptations where it's been implemented in like an after-school program, for example, or a YWCA, or they're a faith-based organization that holds some kind of athletic or activity kind of league kind of thing. So the Institute was one where also there was, you know, a cohort from Florida that came and was trained, and then we were looking to kind of follow up on doing more of that for on-the-ground implementation this year. Is kind of the segue. That's where we're in the midst of the work we're doing together now. I mentioned that it's a weekly program. It's just 15 minutes a week that the coach facilitates the conversation. But the most important thing I'll just end with saying around the dynamics of the program is that, as you can imagine, you know, the magic is, you know, there's words on a page, right? But I'd like to say that the magic is really about the daily opportunity, particularly say in a practice session, that a coach has on being explicit and intentional about their availability to talk to their young people about this stuff. And I have in my mind, we actually started this program, one of the first implementations was in northern Iowa. And I think of this young man, he was a junior in high school and he's a football player. And we're in our pilot phase and we're doing our focus groups. And he goes, you know, we're talking to young men, and that's what I really love the most too. We talk with a lot of advocates, as you obviously are getting, that we talk about, partner, and coaches, of course. But when we talk to youth, when we talk to these young student athletes and hear what the impact is of the program on their lives, is what is just such incredible knowledge and incentive, frankly, to keep going. And he said, so this young man said, he goes, you know, nobody talks to us about this stuff. We're just expected to know. And you really always, I think of him, I have his face so vividly etched in my memory, because it really is like, if we leave it up to if kids are just expected to know, well, then we know where a lot of us and a lot of young people particularly are getting their information from. And so the coach, as a caring and consistent adult, is a key protective factor. Hopefully that we have, we're trying to build a constellation of adults that young people can turn to for, positive advice, and specifically here around issues of increasing their attitudes around gender equity. And so what is so important, and so when I was saying just the piece around a sports team and the collective, how they kind of police each other is also something. I mean, for better or for worse, right? People talk about sports and you say, oh, for better or for worse, the athletes oftentimes are the popular kids, and so if we're able to leverage their leadership, when they in the hallways or locker room and classroom, where the 15-minute conversation is only just the tip of the iceberg, but what do they say? The best defense is an even better offense, and that's really what we believe in with coaching boys and men.
So how many schools, or I guess coaching boys into men programs, do you think you have currently? And again, this is national, right? So we're talking about in a variety of different states across the U.S.
Yeah, so it's been around for a long time. It's been around well over a decade. And so the program has reached well over 100,000 young people. Currently, we focus in on roughly 20 communities that have capacity, right, and have resources where they really become, when we were talking about the Institute as a good example. Last year, there were communities from about 23, 24 different communities from around the country, and actually from Uganda and the Ukraine, as an aside, because we do have adaptations of coaching boys into men around the world as well, that we really focus in on the innovation of the program and the training of the program. And so we are in all 50 states and a whole host of middle school and high schools. And then where we focus in on like kind of an advisory board, advisory council on these roughly 20 communities around the country that serve as our brain trust. And they serve as our CBIM champions in what are new training modalities, what are innovations that we need to make as far as expansions in the program. I touched on per your question around how do we address issues of transphobia specifically within the content, which we created, say, a teachable moment like module that the coaches can bring in, they're trained on, and then they also really raise the issues with their athletes. Again, being proactive about it. We have a ton of coaches that talk about, when anything comes up, they address these issues as a teachable moment, but that's being reactive. And that's a lot more than many people do, right? Where we just brush it under the rug of an incident that happened on campus or something that they heard about happening at a party on a Friday night. Because they hear stuff. They hear their young people talking.
Sure.
And right? So how do we then, with the content, give them the language to be proactive about, and the consistency matters. It can't be, a one and done. We know that there's also the hour and a half of school assembly at the beginning of the year, oftentimes, that everybody comes into and they march into the auditorium and they have a speaker and they come and they talk about it. And maybe that conversation is also really useful. But if we end it there,
Right.
then, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months down the road, we have to keep the consistency up. And so people are also consistently coming in and out of the program.
Okay, so we did have a question that popped up. It's from Marty Sachs. Hi, Marty. So she would like to know, when you work to reach male athletes and their coaches, are your materials and curriculum accessible without going through the local schools or organizations?
Absolutely. And this is what I was mentioning about the website in particular. And we have folks reach out to us, it makes sense. We're in the Bay Area, or Brian and I are. We have folks reach out to us who are parents, community members, who are coaches. I had a coach reach out to me from North Dakota a couple months ago who has had no connection to an advocate or anything, but saw the program and was like, oh, how do I do this? And so that's something that we also provide support around for them to say, okay, here's all of the resources online. They're very comprehensive. And so with the time that people can put in to read through them, to watch the webinars and such, people can access them, on their own time as well.
Mm-hmm. So with everything that's happening now around COVID-19, has everything switched to, I guess, to virtual? Or, I know it's the summertime. I don't know anything about sports. So I don't know if there are normally sports happening right now, but kind of what's happening right now with everything, and how have you had to pivot?
I'll jump in, Jesse, and then we are in uncharted territory.
As we all are.
We and the accessibility piece. So, COVID didn't create virtual engagement, right? We were always looking to, as Jesse said, on coachescorner.org, there are training webinars that already pre-existed. And so we were always looking to what could be a more sophisticated online training of our coaches, because we knew that then we'd be able to train more coaches to deliver the program. What has accelerated in this time of COVID is, like I was saying, is our need to be more sophisticated, more engaging, and really figure out what are those specific devices online that really can try to bring the in-person engagement into more of a virtual environment. There is no substitute for in-person training.
Sure.
And so the way we look at it down the road is it's going to be more of a braided model, as you can imagine, right? As things start to open back up, it will never be what it was before, right? And we are looking at it as an opportunity to bring various elements of our coaches' training online. What is a big question mark, to be frank, is what it looks like for coaches who are then going to be delivering to their athletes if they're not practicing.
Right.
We do know, so when you said, oh, what's happening in the summer, we do know that there's been it's a total mixed bag. Depending on the sport, depending on the resources that the school has, the district, depending on, as somebody asked about, like I said, I always default to schools, but depending on, say, a Boys and Girls Club, after school program, they are doing some virtual practices, right? Like conditioning or talking about issues around nutrition as you're home, right? And I want to call out one piece of this. It's really important as well that in thinking about coaching boys and men, we're saying it was the social connectedness, having that consistency of practice is also a very trauma-informed approach for ensuring that routines really matter, right? For all of us, and particularly for young people in this time of such uncertainty. And so maintaining sports and the athletics is, sure, it's the sport itself, but for us, it's maintaining these conversations and this education in a consistent fashion. So yes, moving the training online, we are definitely gearing up for back to school, and we have to just keep moving as though, you know, things will begin to open up and we will, you know, resume in-person engagement in some way someday. And that's what we've been doing, is reimagining what that looks like.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about your relationship with agencies or organizations in Florida. So I know that you did a training here last year, I think, in Orlando, and I know that one of the other organizations that we fund, which I know that you have been in contact with, is AVDA, Aid to Victims of Domestic Abuse, and they were actually on Impact Tuesdays a few weeks ago. And I see that Matt Tyler is participating in the webinar today. So hello to Matt. And so I know that Matt and some of his colleagues at AVDA attended the training and went through that. But what else can you tell me about kind of what you're doing with Florida for right now?
So we recently, as you know, it's kind of a good segue from our question around, like, what is it going to look like as far as the training? Because the plan was, as our most recent award with you began April 1st. And so we were looking to have a training this summer and into the back to school. And we also know that there's been a lot of changes and transition with, as you know, when we're talking about local partners, with the Florida Coalition. And so we did have a recent conversation with some of those staff who have now moved into a position technically with the state, as some of you probably know about that transition. And so with the state around kind of how we can best resurrect some of the energy from last year's training into helping to implement the program in Florida. We're working from an Engaging Men standpoint. We are working more specifically with AVDA and in a program funded also by the U.S., the Federal Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women, on engaging men broadly. And so AVDA is a sub-grantee of ours on that award, and we're also looking at various prevention practices that focus in on engaging men that'll be specific to Florida in that context too. So I guess the short answer is, you know, we are engaging our local partners, just like how we typically do with the model in Florida, and figuring out what each county's kind of fall is going to look like when it comes to particularly schools opening up or any other programs that are going to be taking place, and where Coaching Boys and Men can be integrated into that right now. So we've just started some of those discussions as far as retooling and reimagining the summer and back to school time period.
Okay.
And do you mind if I just say one more piece on that?
Yeah, of course, Jesse.
I think the other piece around that too, in addition to identifying kind of identifying which communities are kind of most ready, most set up, most, you know, to jump in, and where there's that appetite, is there's the ideal implementation of Coaching Boys into Men, and then there is, because we've opted to have because anyone can go on the website and use the curriculum, which I think is so important. Like we were saying, can someone who isn't a part of an organization or, you know, have an advocate behind them? But in an ideal world, you know, it's important to provide, financial support for coaches who are implementing. It's important to provide, you know, what is it called? I guess I'll just use the word swag for coaches or for athletes, you know, incentives for them to really be implementing, in addition to for evaluation. We just know that money does go a long way when it comes to these elements. So when we think about what it looks like also to invest in communities so that the implementation goes from just one or two coaches to a whole school, that's where when we put a lot of extra effort, which ideally, you know, this work and partnering with, you know, JWF, AVDA, that will enable us to do that.
Okay. So since Matt is on the webinar with us, I was just going to unmute him for a minute and just have him say hello and see if he can. Matt, you're muted, but I just unmuted you. Maybe you can pop on and just say, since you're with AVDA and you have gone through the training, I would just love to kind of hear from you, what that experience was like.
Okay. Well, thank you for, I guess, unmute me and let me up on. Didn't expect that. But hi, Brian. Hi, Jesse. And hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Matt.
No, Futures is great. I was at that institute that they had mentioned, being out there as a cohort from Florida last summer. And we did do one of the adaptations, as kind of Brian mentioned, with like an after-school program that we had developed a relationship with. And for me and our other male educator, Marcos, who's also, been trained as a trainer, just facilitated the conversations with young men that we had there. And they really take to it and engage in the conversations. And also just Futures is great with that support. So I always know if we do have questions or if I need to reach out, they're always there. The trainings are great. We recommend them to anybody, and just anywhere where you can connect and support each other and bringing this to wherever in the community we can. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, thank you, Matt.
He's not a paid. Well, hold on. I do have a question for Matt. Sorry. And everybody, we did not plan him. He's not a paid spokesperson, but no. Matt, where it's not coaching boys and men specifically, and Matt talked about his counterpart around the male education, and given also the work that they are another grantee, and I don't know if you're specifically, say, funding this specific work, but what could be interesting for other people on the phone is certainly work that's being done in your area and in your community. And Matt, I'd love, and if it's still going on, could you share a little bit about the work that you do with men, where it was the program of working with music and about positive lyrics? I think it was like a hip hop artist that you also talked a bit about, because it's just a cool program. And I guess what it's going to illuminate is that we try to come at this from all different angles when it comes to engaging men as as a banner on this work.
Okay, yeah. So my work specifically is funded from like OVW. So I know you guys mentioned, Futures Without Violence works with OVW and does a lot of that programming. So like you said, it's just all these different, I kind of look at it as kind of tools in the toolbox. So whether it's sports or, as you mentioned, music. What we did with the music is like, you said, kind of coaching boys and men started as public education and that kind of area. So part of our work was developing messaging and looking at how do we take that message into different spaces where we can impact, young people, specifically young men. So we partnered with a local artist, and he was already doing positive messaging music, and he came and worked with some of the boys we were mentoring and created, so we did like PSAs and video series, in the process of developing like a comic book. So just all these kind of that outer layer messaging that we can do to find those ways to bring that messaging to the young men, right? Because sports is one, but also music and culture is just another way to get to that.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. I appreciate you impromptu jumping in and giving us some additional information. And for those of you who don't know, AVDA is based in Palm Beach County. All right. So I am a few more questions before we wrap up. So one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the efficacy of the program, and also, how do you measure success, and what, I guess, what are the metrics that you use for success?
So the program has some very deep evidence. In particular, we identify 3 core outcomes that are tested via survey instruments on a pre-survey, right, where we're trying to establish a baseline, and then a post-survey immediately after the program, and then we even do a 12-month follow-up. The 3 core outcomes for the program where we've been able to see some really significant statistical movement is around 1, increasing knowledge of abusive behaviors, building one's intention to intervene positively and safely in the issue, and then also increasing in gender equitable attitudes and increasing gender equitable attitudes. And then what we also saw in 12 months follow-up was an actual reduction in abuse perpetration. So the program has undergone 2 randomized controlled trials, 2 extensive controlled trials that were funded by the CDC, 1 in high school and 1 most recently released and published in JAMA, in the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics earlier this year, around our movement in middle school. Those 3 outcomes, right, when you talk about increasing knowledge of abusive behaviors and then also trying to build kind of upstander, more positive bystander behavior, are really core to the way in which Coaching Boys and Men works. And so what we do is we track from, obviously, as I mentioned, from the beginning as a baseline, all the way through typically a 3-month sports season, fall, winter, and spring, across those key outcomes. That's the randomized controlled trial is, we have, for example, the most recent middle school program, it was in 42 schools, so half the schools got the program and the other half did not get the program, and we're tracking it. And then of course, afterwards we switch. There is a more abridged version for everyday community surveying. Not every community is going to have a control group and an intervention group and be that extensive, but we really do embed and prioritize as program assessment in all that we do.
And that's something where, it's a really exciting piece that we're moving into the future with too, not just in terms of evaluation on those specific, behavioral elements, but, one big priority for us this year and next year is increasing our ability to track implementation and data around implementation, which is both just about kind of really hard numbers, but also relatedly, we have a lot of schools and partners who are interested in learning more about how has behavior in their school changed over time. And some of that likely will not be randomized control trial, which is of course the gold standard in terms of evidence, but for us to be able to create tools and provide, sometimes it's just having like a database that people can use, which is not, understanding Salesforce, for instance, is not an easy thing. So for us to be able to provide some of that background and support for folks to say, okay, well, let me take a look at this over a few years. Who are the students who have received Coaching Boys into Men, who haven't? That's something we're really looking into and we're very excited about.
So do you think that you could share maybe 1 or 2 anecdotes, from the program, either from a participant or from a coach?
So, sorry, could you be more, there's plenty.
I think just some kind of feedback that you've received, like similar to what you mentioned earlier, that demonstrates that the program is effective or that you feel like it's really working well.
I'll share an anecdote that, and I think there's a healthy skepticism that many folks who we talk to about the program have when they enter into a conversation with us around engaging athletic coaches, talking about everyday sports, talking about how do you train a room full of coaches. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many of us are in rooms with 20 coaches, but how, it's right. They're a particular group. And, it's a dynamic where what the coach says goes, right? The coach is there. They're the ones that are instructing you around the various plays, like I said, around your conditioning, your nutrition. And so how do you break down, right, how they're going to really run their practice in some ways, where they're giving their athletes more voice and choice within these conversations? You're going to have a room full of out-school athletic coaches and talk to them about consent and violence against women, right? Even though the grand majority, subscribe to it being an important issue that needs to be addressed with young people, how do we enter? So the anecdote I'm thinking of is like, there's a healthy skepticism because people go, do coaches really role play and really do this work with you in training? And they do.
Right.
They do, because we enter into it with the expectation, with the assumption that you care about the health, safety, and wellness of young people, right? And so Coach Albergini, one of the winningest coaches in the country for football, and, you know, that's typically also our core partner in the school. And again, I'm just defaulting to school, is the athletic director, who oftentimes is a coach as well. So they will then, and so Coach Albergini, AD, been coaching for 30 years. This happened to be in California, and I think his school at the time was the second best football team in the country. California, Texas, Florida, we're big, you know, like Friday Night Lights kind of schools, right? Even areas of Pennsylvania, I mean, you can imagine, I mean, stadium size, like high school.
Sure.
So this guy, you know, man, I tell you, a couple of times I literally would be in the school and walking down the hallway, and I saw him, and he caught my eye and would turn around and try to, you know, because he knew he was like, oh man, they're coming for me because I missed this week, or I didn't, you know, deliver the Coaching Boys and Men program, or I chuckle because that same guy come the end of it, because what we did was, you know, as I kind of, you know, set up my my approach, right, and said, hey, you know, I'm not here to chastise you, right? I'm here to partner with you around what's going to work for you around delivering this program, but it's bigger than that, right? What kind of program, and I say program with a big P, what kind of culture on your team with one of the best football teams in the country? I know your kids walk around and other kids look up to them. What are we trying to teach them? What kind of young men are we asking them and trying to have them be? And he's the same guy, became one of our greatest advocates. People listened to what he had to say. And he said, you know, Brian, I didn't want to do this program when at first. And I knew that already, because I'm like, yeah, you turn around and run away from me.
Right.
But he goes, it's one of the best things I've ever done. And so we hear that. We do hear that.
That's amazing.
And, you know, we also hear sometimes the partners of these coaches, like, what have you done with my husband? Because when that happens, you know, and I wish we could actually do more of that too, around doing more qualitative around, you know, peers and partners that are coming in and out of these coaches and young men's lives. Because that's really, when you said the social norm change, Jennifer, you said the social change program, that's how it ripples out. Right?
Sure. So we are.
Sorry, that was a long.
No. It was great. So we are just coming up on 2:00. So quickly before we wrap up, Brian and Jesse, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here. If anyone who is listening is interested in learning more about the program or the organization, where should they go?
Please visit us at, I could do a little whole pitch right now. Please visit us at futureswithoutviolence.org or coachescorner.org are the two kind of most immediate websites that you can reach to. The Coaches Corner website also has our email, coaches@futureswithoutviolence.org, an email that goes directly to us that we get a lot of questions about, support that we can provide. Has so many resources up there. Please reach out. And futureswithoutviolence.org will have, thank you, Brian, for putting that in the chat, has a ton of information about all of our programs, including our health team, our legal team, our workforce team. So there's a lot of other work that Brian and I don't even have our fingers in. Those are the two places.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And yes, thank you, Brian, for sending out the URLs in the chat. And thank you to everyone who is here with us today. I hope that you found this really interesting. I'm sure you did. Again, we're so proud to support this important program. There will be another Impact Tuesdays in 2 weeks from today, and actually JWF will be the featured organization. because there's a lot of work that we do that I think that our trustees and members of the community probably don't know about. I always like to say at the end, you can check out our website, jwfpalmbeach.org. We are 100% supported by individual donations. So would love to have you support our work at any amount. It definitely helps us to provide grants and education and all the other wonderful work that we do. So Brian and Jesse, please stay safe, be healthy, and everyone else, I will hopefully see you in 2 weeks. So take care and thank you. Bye.